The hypothalamus is called the neuroendocrine organ, and it's also known as the master control of the endocrine system. It controls other endocrine organs, namely the anterior pituitary gland. It's difficult to talk about the hypothalamus without referring to the other endocrine organs that you might not yet be familiar with. It's highly recommended that you revisit this mini lecture after covering hormones of the pituitary glands. The hypothalamus has three main jobs. Number one, the hypothalamus makes its own hormones, which are then stored in the pituitary gland, but it makes its own hormones. Number two, the hypothalamus controls both the posterior and the anterior pituitary gland, and the hypothalamus tells those two organs when to release their hormones. So the hypothalamus provides a hormonal trigger for most of these organs it controls, but it also can provide a neural trigger for these organs that it controls. So it can send a hormone and say, release your hormone, or it can send an action potential and say, release your hormone. Lastly, the hypothalamus stimulates the adrenal medulla. And this was something that we discussed briefly in the autonomic nervous system last semester. The adrenal gland has two parts. It's got this outside covering called the cortex, and then the juicy inside called the medulla. The hypothalamus has a direct connection to the neurons in the medulla. However, the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland, which releases hormones that control the adrenal. Just wait, it'll get worse. The hypothalamus makes its own hormones separate from controlling the pituitary gland. Let's do a little anatomy here. The pituitary gland has two lobes, and it sits just posterior to the crossing of the optic nerves. If I were to look at your head, top down, here are your eyes bulging out, your optic nerves, cranial nerves too, they cross. And that crossing, which is called the optic chiasma, is right here anterior to the pituitary gland. So that means that this one colored orange is the anterior and this one colored brown is the posterior pituitary gland. The hypothalamus contains a lot of neurons, which you can see over here. All of these pretty colored blotches are the nuclei of the many different neurons contained in the hypothalamus. There are two specifically that it contains: the supraoptic neurons and the paraventricular neurons. It also contains some other neurons that just kind of innervate the top of the infundibulum there, and those are called neurosecretory neurons. The supraoptic and the paraventricular neurons, they extend all the way into the pituitary gland and they innervate the posterior pituitary gland. Neurosecretory neurons, they don't do that. Neurosecretory neurons don't go into the infundibulum. Neurosecretories are just confined to the hypothalamus itself. This is this narrow stalk that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary. That is called the infundibulum. During a sheep brain dissection, the infundibulum, it's very thin and it can break off. And many times students will say to me, my sheep has no pituitary gland. And I'm like, I guarantee it does, but it probably ripped off with the meninges. Okay, so let's discuss the vascularization or the arteries and veins in this area. There are a few things, a few systems in your body that are called portal systems. And a portal system is a direct connection of vessels between one organ and another. So what gets in that direct connection, what gets into that portal system is not in general circulation. It's only going from one organ to another. Another example of a portal system is the hepatic portal system, which is a direct connection between your small intestine and your liver. All the food that enters into your small intestine, it's absorbed, and then before it gets sent out into general circulation, it's sent directly to the liver so that it can be cleansed or filtered. And here we have a direct connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland, just the anterior. So blood comes to the hypothalamus by this superior hypophyseal artery, which is right there, which you can see is the only superior artery that vascularizes the top or the superior portion of the infundibulum. This artery runs through the infundibulum and makes a direct connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. When the hypothalamus releases hormones, like the cortisol releasing hormone, it enters right into this portal system. Blood leaves the hypothalamus, grabs those hormones, and then distributes it down here to the anterior pituitary gland. So I can never measure the hormones in this portal system. I can never know how much CRH, TRH, GHRH. I can never know how much of these releasing hormones that you actually release because I can never measure them. Blood leaves the anterior pituitary gland by way of these inferior hypophyseal veins, but the problem is the hormones, the releasing hormones, have already been used up by the anterior pituitary gland. So the blood leaving these two veins will not contain the hypothalamus's hormones. The inferior hypophyseal artery, which is this one right here, this is what vascularizes the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary gland, blood comes in, it picks up the hormones in here, and then it leaves by these two veins. The thing is, though, that the hormones in the posterior are only released when an action potential is sent down any of these neurons. And this is what gives you the difference between these two pituitary glands. The anterior pituitary gland is controlled tropically. There are hormones that control the release of anterior pituitary glands. The posterior pituitary glands are controlled neurally. They have a neural trigger. There is an action potential that is sent to tell them to release their hormones. Okay, so returning to the hypothalamus's jobs. First, its job is to make its own hormones. And it does that. It produces two hormones, one called oxytocin and one called ADH, which is the antidiuretic hormone, which basically means it's the I don't want to pee out all my water hormone. The supraoptic nucleus produces oxytocin. The paraventricular nucleus produces ADH. And these hormones travel down these neurons to be stored in the posterior pituitary gland, and the posterior pituitary gland will later receive an action potential from the hypothalamus to release these. These two hormones are discussed in much more detail in the mini lecture on the posterior pituitary gland. The second job of the hypothalamus is to control the anterior pituitary gland. And unlike the posterior pituitary, the anterior uses a completely different mechanism. There are cells or nuclei in the hypothalamus that release hormones into this hypophyseal portal system. And this hypophyseal portal system, it's a one-way communication. So it only can take blood from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland. So there's no back talk. The APG cannot back talk to the hypothalamus. What the hypothalamus does is it releases hormones that are called either releasing hormones or hormones that are called inhibiting hormones. Let's start here with just releasing hormones as an example. You can dip into the anterior pituitary gland mini lecture to look at inhibiting hormones. So all of these hormones that I have listed here are releasing hormones. When the hypothalamus senses that a hormone such as the thyroid hormone is low in the body, what the hypothalamus does is it sends a releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary gland, and the correct cells in the APG will then release their hormone. And one example is that the hypothalamus releases TRH to stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to release TSH. There are many other hormones that it could release, like ACTH, which I don't know how to spell, growth hormone, LH, and FSH. But all of these hormones here are hormones that have a hormonal trigger. These hormones are only released by the direction of another hormone. And finally, the hypothalamus has a direct connection by neurons to the adrenal medulla. It doesn't actually work the way that I've drawn it right here, but this is, I mean, it gives you an idea. What happens is if when your hypothalamus detects a threat, whether that threat be realistic, like somebody steals your fanny pack in a dark parking lot, or whether it be something related to anxiety about an upcoming test, which is very real, but you may have exaggerated that anxiety. So when the hypothalamus detects a threat, it sends an action potential to the adrenal medulla. And that action potential, it's got to go through the spinal cord. It uses some nerves called splanchnic nerves. And what it does is it triggers your adrenal medulla to release two things, to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. Two things that we talked about as neurotransmitters in the nervous tissue section. But here, epinephrine and norepinephrine are hormones because they're being released into general circulation. And these hormones have systemic effects, meaning that there's not just one organ, there's many. And the effect is basically it's initiating a fight or flight response by causing various organs in the body to react. And this feedback loop is also discussed in more detail on the mini lecture on the adrenal medulla.